Trunk is honestly one of the most interesting, thought-provoking, and skilled brawlers in the game, to the point that even I'm confused by him. Not exactly an inspiring intro, sure, but even still, Trunk is such an interesting brawler, yet has been overshadowed by basically every other brawler due to his terrible release date. In this video, we'll talk about Trunk's basics, and then talk about how important proper brawler releases are to a brawler, as well as talk about Trunk and what makes him special compared to a brawler like Jackie, as well as much more. If you want a fun place to talk about Brawl Stars or participate in our 1v1 rank system called Gauntlet, and just general stuff, join our Discord server. Link will be in the description. Also, make sure to subscribe to keep up with the PowerPoints, and finally, if you want to help support the channel, become a member. First, let's start with the basics. Trunk is a tank, but so is every other tank. Anyway, he has 10,400 health with a fast movement speed and has the tank trait, which will come up later. Trunk's main attack is quite interesting. It's basically a very similar attack to Jackie and Doug, and it deals 2100 damage normally, but if you manage to hit enemies at the edge of the radius, you'll deal 2800 damage. Furthermore, the attack happens after a 0.35 second delay, as well as having a 3.33 tower range, and a 1.5 second reload speed. Finally, every time he attacks, he leaves behind an area of ants with a 3.33 tower radius, lasting for 20 seconds. If Trunk is standing on top of it, he gains 20% increased movement speed and 30% increased damage boost. Trunk's super sees him dash forward 7 tiles, dropping ants throughout the path of his super. If Trunk hits an enemy, he moves slower, dealing low damage continuously every 0.05 seconds. Furthermore, like Daryl, he can extend his super range with rolling over water, and more importantly, he can bounce off of walls when using his super. However, he can also be interrupted during the super with a crowd control ability. Now let's turn the clock back to when Trunk was released. On release, it's fair to say he was an F tier brawler. Genuinely horrible, and well, there was a few reasons why. First of all, and most importantly, he didn't have the tank trait. Why they would release a brawler who has the playstyle that Trunk does, and still not give them the tank trait is completely beyond me. Trunk relies quite a lot on having a super to actually be useful, and not having the tank trait basically means he was never getting a super. Furthermore, his main attack was horrendous, at least in comparison to someone like Jackie, with a large attack delay and having to precisely aim attacks to actually make good use out of it. And even then, the damage was simply not worth it. Finally, he didn't have a hypercharge, which obviously is just the icing on the cake. So Trunk was in the F tier for quite a while, but later he did actually get his buffs, with a solid hypercharge, a main attack damage buff, and a health buff. And most importantly, the tank trait. He's honestly a solid brawler now, being a high B tier brawler, and even having the highest win rate in the game, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. Yet, he's currently one of the lowest played brawlers in the game despite only releasing a few months back, and having gotten multiple buffs. But why? Well, it all has to do with his release date. There's a reason people say their first impression is extremely important, and it's no different with brawlers and Brawl Stars. We've seen this before with Willow, who was released in quite a bad state. And guess what? Despite multiple buffs and an objectively interesting design, she is one of the lower used brawlers in the game, having never recovered from her poor release. And the same thing is true for Trunk, as being released poorly at such a make or break time for popularity basically spelled doom for him, and his playstyle didn't help either. With that being said, let's finally start talking about Trunk himself and his playstyle and nuances. First of all, the Pam in the room. Yes, he's very similar to Jackie, and at first glance you would say that he's even worse. They have basically the same main attack, but Trunk's is basically exponentially worse, with a huge attack delay, and unless he hits his crit, he deals less damage as well. And of course, Jackie has much more reliable speed without having to rely on having ants or getting her super, as she has her gadget. With all that being said, why pick Trunk over Jackie? And of course, Doug, who can literally revive himself or teammates, as well as self-heal or heal teammates, on top of having basically a better main attack. Well, let me put it this way. Jackie is more reliable, and I would say she has a lower skill floor, but also a lower skill ceiling than Trunk, who is less reliable, but has a higher skill floor and a higher skill ceiling. What this means basically, for most players, Jackie is the better pick, but for the best of the best, which I must say does not include me, Trunk is the much better pick. But why? Well, first of all, we need to talk about Trunk's ants. Trunk's ants are what truly separates him from the rest of the tanks. Every time he uses his main attack or his super, he places down a patch of ants, which gives him a movement speed buff and an attack damage buff. This can be exploited by strategically using your main attack, even on nothing, just to increase the ant area, especially if you're in a comfortable position, like having just team wipe the enemies in hot zone. What the ants give Trunk is a permanent buff, and a good one at that, with increased damage that actually begins to justify the attack delay, but much more importantly, more movement speed. This increased movement speed allows Trunk to actually be able to dodge shots, but more importantly, it doubles as an approach tool, allowing him to actually be able to catch up to enemies. Furthermore, with his tank trait now being a thing, this synergizes wonderfully with his ant movement speed buff, as he can now get closer to enemies while also being able to charge up his super while the target is shooting at him. Speaking of his super, this is where Trunk becomes a very interesting brawler. See, his super is actually kind of an anti-tank mechanism. It has insane damage potential and can shred through brawlers if aimed properly. Even better is that it's extremely easy to charge back up if you manage to land it, and even easier when you consider the tank trait, meaning you can potentially cycle supers. All of this combines to make Trunk's super quite good at countering tanks, and he has enough health to stay alive against them, as well as has an insane amount of DPS with his super to severely cut down their health. And of course, the fact that tanks have to face off against Trunk at a short range means that Trunk can usually stay on top of his ants while fighting against them, giving him an even better chance at winning. Honestly, Trunk's super basically turns him into a sort of dive tank. It's quite similar to Daryl's super usage, though I have to say not as much, as Daryl's super is strictly an approach tool, and his main attack is the real damage dealer, while Trunk's super is both an approach tool and the damage dealer. But anyways, Trunk's super allows him to get up close and personal to enemies, and is a great assassination tool as well. Overall, just a great addition to his kit. Furthermore, you can also do some cool stuff with the bouncing ability the super has, like Daryl, and it leads to some really cool plays and trick shots in Brawl Ball. Finally, it obviously allows for much more ants to be on the map, covering a much larger area than the regular attack would, giving Trunk much more area to work with. Overall, his super is what to me definitely sets him apart from brawlers like Jackie or Doug, and for that reason, I would have to say he's not a clone of either of them, and actually has a very unique playstyle, being a combination of a regular tank and a dive tank. Overall, to really make the best use out of Trunk, you do have to learn a bit about him, and spend more time in learning and practicing him than you would Jackie. However, the results will pay off, as a good Trunk can be absolutely diabolical to face off against. I mean, look at his win rate. Yes, brawlers who have low play rates usually have the highest win rates, but Trunk isn't exactly too close to the bottom, yet still has the highest. You could argue that because he released pretty recently, he would have the highest win rate, but he still has a higher win rate than Ziggy and Gigi. Personally, I think he has the highest win rate simply because everyone who plays him are skilled players, who know his ins and outs, and there aren't really any bad players who play him, simply because they lost interest in trying to figure him out after his poor release. Now let's talk about his unlockables. Trunk's first gadget is for the Queen, which sees him instantly spread ants in a large area. This is a really solid star power and gives Trunk an immediate boost, which lets him set up quite nicely if he needs quick ants. His second gadget is Worker Ants, which sees Trunk heal from the first source of damage in the next 2 seconds. This is actually an insane gadget if used correctly. For example, if a Dynamite Hypercharge is used on Trunk, not only will he soak up all the damage from it, he will literally heal the entire amount as well. Of course, this only really works for single projectiles and not well against someone like Colt, for example. but even still, it can be extremely valuable in the right situation. Now, his star powers. Trunk's first star power sees ants also reduce enemy damage by 15%. This is a pretty good star power and actually gives Trunk a bit more controlling ability, forcing enemies to stay away from these ants, or they will probably get cooked by Trunk in a 1v1, considering all the buffs in favor of Trunk and nerfs for the enemy when standing on the ants. Trunk's second star power sees his ants reveal enemies in bushes and invisible enemies. This is like Bo's star power. It's very good in bushy maps, but of course, very situational at the same time. Finally, Trunk's hypercharged retread. This sees Trunk's super leave ants on enemies. Once again, nothing too crazy, but just makes his super even better and even more lethal against enemies, simply making his strengths even more powerful. Overall, Trunk is quite an interesting brawler. At first glance, you would probably see him as a worse Jackie and Doug clone, with the whole attack delay thing especially. However, for skilled players, you can get a lot of value out of Trunk, especially with his interesting ant mechanic and his super, which sort of turns him into a diving, tanky, anti-tank brawler. Thanks to Narcissus for helping out with the video, and as always, thanks for watching. Watch this video, or this playlist, or join the Discord server.